When the millionaire's baby nearly gives up, the housekeeper takes action and transforms everything. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. The desperate cries of a newborn baby cut through the halls of the most luxurious penthouse in Manhattan like a knife. The sound echoed between the tempered glass walls and the Carrara marble, creating a symphony of despair that even the 4,300 square feet of pure elegance could not muffle. It was 3 in the morning on a rainy Tuesday in March, and that crying had already lasted almost an hour without interruption. Edward Morgan, 45, paced back and forth in the living room with a panoramic view of the beach. His grey hair, usually impeccably styled, was disheveled from the vigil. The businessman who ran one of the largest cosmetics empires in the country, known for his firm demeanor and quick decisions, now found himself completely lost in front of a baby just 2 weeks old. "This can't go on, Edward." Isabella's voice echoed from the baby's room, laden with a mix of exhaustion and despair that he had never heard before. Isabella Morgan, at 28, was one of the most followed digital influencers in the US, with over 3 million followers who kept up with her luxurious life and beauty routine. But at that moment, with deep, dark circles marking her bare face and her blonde hair in disarray, she was far from the perfect image she projected on social media. Edward entered the baby's room, a space decorated in shades of blue and white, with imported Italian furniture and a crib that cost more than many people earned in a year. Little Ethan was in his mother's arms, his face red from crying, his fists clenched in despair. "We've tried everything, Isa. The special formula from Switzerland that milk Dr. Smith had compounded." Edward ran his hand over his face, feeling the weight of helplessness. "Maybe we should take him to the hospital again." "For God's sake, Edward, we've been to Mount Sinai 3 times this week. They ran every possible test and said he's healthy." Isabella rocked the baby with increasingly desperate movements. "But he won't accept anything, nothing." From the hallway connecting the kitchen to the bedrooms, Maria Grace watched the scene in silence. At 34, the woman from New Jersey had arrived in New York City just 6 months earlier, bringing with her few belongings and a pain that seemed endless. Her brown eyes, always attentive, followed every movement of the couple with a genuine concern that went far beyond her obligations as a worker. Maria had a small, sturdy body, hands calloused from hard work, and a serene expression that contrasted with the chaos of the house. Her dark hair was always tied back in a simple bun, and she wore the navy blue uniform that Isabella had chosen for all the house staff. But there was something in her eyes that spoke of experience, of a wisdom that did not come from books or money. "Miss Isabella." Maria approached timidly at the door of the nursery, her hands clasped in front of her body. "May I offer a suggestion?" Edward turned abruptly toward the housekeeper, his face contorted with irritation. "Maria, I've already said we don't need an employee's opinion. This is a medical matter being handled by qualified professionals." "Edward, don't be rude to her." Isabella reprimanded her husband, but her voice sounded weak, defeated. "Maria, what were you going to say?" Maria took a deep breath, gathering courage. She knew she was risking her job, but something inside her, perhaps the same instinct that made her wake up in the middle of the night when she heard the baby's cries, prevented her from staying silent. "It's just that back in my hometown in New Jersey, my grandmother always said that some babies are born with a special sensitivity. They need a different kind of care, a milk that has, how can I explain, that has true love." "Love?" Edward laughed sarcastically, walking over to the panoramic window. "Maria, with all due respect, but we're not talking about folk remedies or superstitions. My son needs proper medical treatment, not folklore." Isabella, however, remained silent, watching Maria with an attention she hadn't shown in days. There was something in the way the housekeeper looked at Ethan, a tenderness that she herself felt she had lost amid the despair. "You said you've tried all the imported formulas, right?" Maria continued, ignoring Edward's disapproving look. "But have you tried real breast milk?" The silence that followed was heavy, like the air before a storm. Isabella lowered her eyes, feeling the weight of guilt that had consumed her since Ethan's birth. She had tried to breastfeed, but her body seemed uncooperative. The milk did not come in sufficient quantity, and every time she tried, Ethan cried even more. I tried," Isabella murmured, her voice choked, "but I couldn't. My body, I can't give him what he needs." "It's not your fault, my dear." Maria stepped closer, her voice filled with a maternal tenderness that made Isabella look up. "Sometimes our bodies don't cooperate, but that doesn't make you any less of a mother." Edward watched the conversation with growing impatience. He couldn't understand how his wife could listen to a housekeeper at a moment like this. In his practical and controlling mind, problems needed practical solutions, and practical solutions came from expensive specialists, not home remedies. "Maria, I appreciate your concern, but—" Edward was interrupted by an even sharper cry from Ethan, who seemed to be getting weaker. It was then that Maria made a decision that would change the course of all their lives. She stepped closer to Isabella, hesitantly extending her arms. "Let me hold him for a little bit, just to calm him down. I promise I will be careful." Isabella looked at Edward, who shook his head disapprovingly. But Ethan had been crying for so long, and she was so exhausted that for a moment she considered handing the baby over to the nanny. "Isa, no." Edward was adamant. "We are not handing our son over to a staff member to hold." "A staff member?" Mary repeated the words, and for the first time since she had arrived at that house, a spark of something bordering on irritation shone in her eyes. "Mr. Edward, I know that to you I am just another employee, but I have cared for children my entire life, and—" She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "And I have lost a child. I know what this desperation feels like." Silence returned to dominate the room, but now it was different. There was a raw truth hanging in the air, a pain recognizing another pain. Isabella felt something shift in her chest, a connection that transcended the social barriers that had always defined her life. Slowly, almost as if she were disobeying herself, Isabella extended Ethan towards Mary. Edward stepped forward, but stopped when he saw the gentleness with which the nanny received the baby. Mary held Ethan as if she were holding something sacred, her arms creating a cocoon of protection around the small body. She began to rock the baby with a smooth and natural motion, murmuring words in a low, melodic tone that neither of them could fully understand. "There, my angel. Aunt Mary is here now. Let's see what you really need." And then something extraordinary happened. Ethan stopped crying. After 4 days of relative calm, the nightmare resumed with full force. Ethan had accepted some bottles under Mary's care, but now, on that sunny Saturday morning, he was once again rejecting any food with a vehemence that sent everyone into a panic. The baby cried incessantly, even refusing the sweetened water that the pediatrician had recommended as a last resort. Mary watched everything from the open kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared the breakfast coffee that she knew no one would be able to eat. She'd been awake all night, not because of work, but because her maternal instinct wouldn't let her rest while she listened to the desperate cries coming from the next room. "My God, Edward! He's getting dehydrated!" Isabella shouted from the bedroom, her voice heavy with a desperation that grew with each passing hour. "Look how limp he is. We need to do something." Edward rushed into the kitchen, the phone pressed to his ear. His eyes were red from fatigue and worry. "Dr. Smith? Yes, it's urgent. Ethan hasn't accepted anything for over 12 hours. What do you mean it's normal? Normal is my son withering away. Mary approached discreetly, drying her hands on her apron. She could see the tension in Edward's shoulders, the way he clenched his free fist while speaking to the doctor. From the bedroom came Ethan's intermittent cries, weaker and more spaced out. "No, doctor, it's not colic. It's something different." Edward shouted into the phone. "He simply won't accept any type of milk. We've tried 15 different brands." When Edward hung up the phone forcefully, Mary gathered all her courage. She knew she was about to cross a line that could never be undone, but the life of that child was at stake. "Mr. Edward," she began, her voice low but firm, "I have an idea, but you're going to think I'm crazy." "Mary, for God's sake, this isn't the time to—" Edward stopped mid-sentence when he saw the expression on the nanny's face. There was something there he had never noticed before, a determination that didn't match the submissive posture she always maintained. "I still have milk." The words came from Mary in a whisper, but they echoed in the kitchen like thunder. "I still have breast milk. I lost my son 4 months ago, but my body still produces." Edward froze, processing what he had just heard. For a moment his practical mind clashed with the desperate situation. It was unthinkable. It was embarrassing. It was— "What did you say?" Isabella had appeared at the kitchen door, holding Ethan, the baby now crying so weakly that it sounded more like a lament. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and she looked at Mary as if seeing a ghost. "I said I still have breast milk," Mary repeated, this time looking directly at Isabella. "My son, he was born on the same day as Ethan, but he didn't survive. Complications during birth." Her voice trembled slightly. "Since then, my body has continued to produce milk. It's as if it's been waiting for another child to care for." The silence in the kitchen was absolute, broken only by Ethan's weak cries. Isabella looked at her husband, then at Mary, and then at the son in her arms. The child was visibly thinner, his lips dry, his movements increasingly sluggish. "Are you suggesting that—" Isabella couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm suggesting that I feed Ethan from my breast, like I did with my John." Mary spoke the words with a simplicity that contrasted with the magnitude of what she was proposing. "It's nothing unusual. It's what any wet nurse would have done in the past. It's natural." "Natural?" Edward exploded. "Mary, you're suggesting that a staff member breastfeed my son. Do you understand what you're saying?" "I understand that your son is starving," Mary replied, her voice firm enough to make Edward take a step back. "And I understand that my milk could save him." Isabella stepped closer to Mary, studying her face with a new intensity. She could see the sincerity in the nanny's brown eyes, but more than that, she could see pain, a pain that mirrored her own. "Do you really think it could work?" Isabella asked, ignoring her husband's disapproving look. "I'm sure." Mary extended her hand. "Let me try? If it doesn't work, you can fire me tomorrow, but if it does—" "Isabella, no!" Edward stepped between his wife and the cook. "This is ridiculous. I'll call another pediatrician. I'll take Ethan to Chicago if necessary, but I won't allow a stranger—" "A stranger?" Isabella turned to her husband with a fury he had never seen before. "Edward, this stranger is the only person in this house who has shown true care for our son. And look at him. Look at his condition." Ethan had stopped crying, not because he was better, but because he had no strength left. His breathing was shallow, and even in his mother's arms, he seemed to be drifting away from the world. Without warning, Isabella walked towards Mary and placed Ethan in her arms. "Do something, please." Edward stepped forward as if to stop his wife, but Isabella faced him with a determination he hadn't seen since they first met. "Edward, our son is dying. And if you can't swallow your pride to save him, then you're not the man I thought you were." Mary received Ethan with the gentleness of someone picking a flower about to wilt. She looked at the baby, then at the parents, and made a decision that would change all their lives forever. "I'll take him. To my room. It's more private," Mary said, already walking towards the small back room where she slept. "Isabella, you can come with me if you want. Edward." She looked at him with a mix of understanding and challenge. "You can stay here or come too, but I won't let this child starve because you're ashamed." Edward stood frozen in the kitchen, watching his wife follow the cook. For the first time in his adult life, he felt completely out of control. All his resources, all his influence, all his money, none of that mattered now. The salvation of his son was in the hands of a simple woman he barely knew. In Mary's room, a small, tidy space with a single bed, a wooden dresser and a few family photos, Isabella watched in silence as the cook prepared. Mary sat on the edge of the bed, adjusted Ethan in her arms, and with a naturalness that moved Isabella, offered her breast to the hungry baby. What happened next was almost miraculous. Ethan, who had rejected any food for days, immediately latched onto Mary's breast and began to suck with desperate hunger. The soft sound of breastfeeding filled the small room, and for the first time in weeks there was peace. Isabella began to cry, not from sadness or humiliation, but from a relief so deep it felt physical. She sat beside Mary on the bed, watching her son finally feed. "Thank you," Isabella whispered, her voice choked. "Thank you for saving my son." Mary smiled, a look of contentment that lit up her entire face. "You don't need to thank me, my daughter. That's what my milk is for, to nourish a child in need." And there, in the small cook's room, two mothers connected in a way that neither fully understood. One had given life, the other was sustaining that life, and both knew that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. 3 weeks had passed since the day Mary saved Ethan from starvation, and the household routine had changed completely. What had started as an emergency act had now turned into a dependency that left everyone uncomfortable, each for different reasons. Ethan thrived in Mary's arms. The baby had regained the lost weight and developed rosy cheeks that contrasted with the concerning pallor of the previous weeks. But the price of this salvation was taking an emotional toll on everyone involved. It was Tuesday, 8 in the morning, when Dr. Smith arrived at the penthouse for another house call. The renowned pediatrician, at 60 years old with impeccably trimmed grey beard, carried an Italian leather briefcase and an air of someone about to solve a medical mystery that had intrigued him for weeks. "Good morning, Edward. Isabella." Dr. Smith greeted the couple in the living room, immediately noticing the tension that hung in the air like morning fog. "How is our little patient?" "Physically perfect," Edward replied, his voice laden with barely concealed irritation. "Gaining weight, sleeping well, developing normally. But the situation is—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's unsustainable." Isabella was sitting on the white leather sofa, wearing a pink silk robe that cost more than many people earned in a month, but her face was bare of makeup, her hair disheveled, and she looked like a shadow of the glamorous influencer she used to be. "Doctor, I need to understand one thing." Isabella leaned forward, her hands nervously intertwined. "How is it possible that my son will only accept the milk from a staff member and completely rejects mine and all the imported formulas you prescribed?" Dr. Smith opened his briefcase and pulled out some test results, spreading them on the marble coffee table. "Isabella, I brought the results of the more detailed tests I requested, and the news is enlightening." From the hallway leading to the bedrooms, Mary appeared carrying Ethan, who was visibly satisfied and sleepy after the morning feeding. She wore her usual navy blue uniform, but there was something different about her posture. The central role she had taken in saving the child had given her a confidence she hadn't possessed before. "Excuse me," Mary said respectfully. "Ethan fed well and is already sleepy. I'll put him in the crib." "No, Mary, stay here," Edward said, surprising everyone, including himself. "What the doctor is going to say concerns you too." Mary hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Mary was used to staying in the background, to being invisible. But now, holding the baby who depended on her, she could no longer hide. Dr. Smith looked at Mary with a scientific interest that made her feel like a laboratory specimen. "Mary, isn't it? Can you tell me about your diet? About your overall health?" "Doctor, Mary glanced at Edward and Isabella, silently asking for permission to respond. "Go ahead, Mary," Isabella encouraged, her voice softer than it usually was with staff. "I've always eaten well, Doctor. Back home we eat a lot of vegetables, fruits and fish. My mother always said that breast milk reflects what the mother eats." Mary gently rocked Ethan as she spoke. "And I've never had health problems. I've always been strong." Dr. Smith took some notes, then held up one of the tests. "Edward, Isabella, what I'm about to say may be hard to accept, but Ethan has a condition called severe intolerance to specific proteins. It's not a common allergy, it's something more complex." "But does that explain why he won't accept formulas?" Isabella asked, a spark of hope shining in her eyes. "It partially explains. All industrialized formulas, even hypoallergenic ones, contain compounds that Ethan's body identifies as a threat." The doctor turned to Isabella. "And regarding your milk, Isabella, tests show that you have a deficiency of certain enzymes that would make your milk compatible with Ethan's specific needs." The silence that followed was heavy. Isabella felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Not only had she been unable to breastfeed her son, her own body was inadequate to nourish him. "So," Edward began, his voice coming out lower than he intended, "Ethan can only be fed by someone whose body produces exactly what he needs," Dr. Smith completed, "and apparently Mary is that person." Mary lowered her eyes, feeling the weight of 6 gazes upon her. Ethan slept peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the complexity of the situation that his simple need for nourishment had created. "Doctor, does this mean that—" Isabella couldn't finish the question. "It means that, at least for the next few months, while Ethan cannot eat solid foods, Mary is essential for his survival." Dr. Smith put the tests away in his folder. "It's an unusual situation, but not unprecedented in medicine." Edward abruptly stood up and walked to the panoramic window, watching the hustle and bustle of Brooklyn below. Luxury cars, people heading to their daily activities, life going on as usual. Meanwhile, up there in his own home, he had become a hostage to a caregiver. "And how long will this last?" Edward asked, not turning around. "Typically, children with this condition can start accepting appropriate solid foods around 6 months, but Ethan is a special case. It could take up to a year." "A year?" Isabella repeated, her voice faltering. Mary shifted uncomfortably, adjusting Ethan in her arms. "Mr. Morgan, Mrs. Morgan, if this is a problem for you, I can—" "What can you do, Mary?" Edward turned, frustration exploding in his voice. "Let my son starve? Find someone else who miraculously has the exact type of milk he needs." "Edward, don't yell at her." Isabella stood up, placing herself between her husband and Mary. "She saved our son." "I know she saved our son," Edward shouted back. "But do you understand the position this puts us in? I, one of the most respected businessmen in this country, depending on a domestic worker to keep my only heir alive." Edward's words echoed through the room like gunshots. Mary felt each one as a slap, but she maintained her composure. She knew her place in this world. She knew exactly how people like Edward viewed her. Mr. Morgan is right, Mary said, her voice calm but firm. I understand that this situation is uncomfortable for you. If you want, I can look for another job. But I will continue coming here every day to feed Ethan until he no longer needs it. What do you mean? Isabella asked. I can live elsewhere, work in another house during the day, and come here for feeding times. That way, you won't have to see me all the time, reminding you that you depend on me. Mary's suggestion created an even more uncomfortable silence. The idea that she could leave the house, even temporarily, made Isabella realize something she hadn't admitted even to herself. She had begun to rely on Mary for much more than just feeding Ethan. Dr. Smith observed the family dynamic with the clinical eye of someone who had witnessed many delicate situations over the years. May I suggest something? Everyone turned to him. Ethan needs stability. Abrupt changes in routine can affect both his development and his ability to feed properly. The doctor closed his folder. My medical recommendation is for Mary to remain in the house, maintaining the routine that has already been established. Routine? Edward laughed bitterly. Doctor, are you telling me to keep a caregiver living in my house because my son has become attached to her? I'm saying to keep the only person capable of keeping your son alive, Dr. Smith replied, with the firmness of someone who knew he was right. And I suggest that all of you find a way to deal with this reality, because it is not going to change any time soon. After the doctor's departure, the family remained in the living room in a silence filled with unspoken tensions. Ethan had woken up and was looking around with the curious eyes of someone discovering the world. For him, none of this mattered. What mattered was that when he felt hungry, there were warm arms and sweet milk waiting for him. Mary broke the silence. I'll prepare your lunch. And she left for the kitchen, carrying Ethan and leaving the couple alone with the weight of a new reality that neither of them was prepared to accept. 2 months had passed. It had been a while since Gabriel's dependency on Mary had become an inescapable reality in the Morgan household. It was a May morning, with the autumn breeze bringing a cooler air that flowed through the open windows of the penthouse. Isabella was in the office, trying to record a video for her followers, something that had become increasingly difficult to do naturally. Hi, everyone. Today I wanted to talk to you about... Isabella paused mid-sentence, turned off the camera, and sighed deeply. How could she explain to 3 million followers that her perfect life had turned into a tangled web of dependencies she couldn't control? On the other side of the house, in the kitchen, Mary was preparing a smoothie, while Gabriel slept in his stroller beside her. The routine had been established. Gabriel fed every 3 hours, slept between feedings, and Mary took advantage of those intervals to keep the house running. But today there was something different in the air, a tension she couldn't identify. Edward entered the kitchen carrying a folder of documents, his face more serious than usual. He had left early for a meeting with lawyers, and Mary could tell from his expression that something important had happened. "Mary, can I talk to you?" Edward said, his voice formal but not hostile as it had been in the early weeks. "Of course, Mr. Morgan, what is it?" Mary dried her hands on her apron, an automatic gesture when she was nervous. Edward sat on the stool at the kitchen island, a casual move that surprised Mary. In the months they had lived together, she had never seen him sit in the kitchen. "We had to run some medical tests on Gabriel for a special health plan," Edward began, shuffling through the papers in the folder. "Complete genetic tests, detailed family history, that sort of thing." Mary felt a tightening in her chest. "Is there a problem with Gabriel?" "No, Gabriel is perfect." Edward looked up from the documents. "But the tests brought some unexpected information about you." "About me?" Mary leaned against the sink, feeling her legs weaken. "Mary, when you filled out your employment form, you said you only had a high school diploma, correct?" "Yes, sir," Mary replied, but her voice came out quieter than she intended. Edward opened one of the documents and placed it on the counter. Then, explain this here. A nursing degree from the University of Chicago, registered with the State Board, with a specialization in pediatrics. The silence that followed was deafening. Mary looked at the document as if she were seeing a ghost, her hands trembling slightly. Gabriel stirred in the stroller, making a soft noise, but he didn't. "Wake up. You are a nurse," Edward said, not as a question but as a statement. A registered pediatric nurse. Mary closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and when she opened them again, there was a dignity in her posture that Edward had never seen. "I was," Mary corrected. "I was a nurse." "Was? What do you mean, was?" Mary walked over to Gabriel's stroller, watching the baby sleep peacefully. "I worked at the Children's Hospital of Chicago for 6 years. It was my life. Until—" She paused, her voice choking. Edward waited, realizing he was about to discover something important. "Until my John was born," Mary continued, still looking at Gabriel. "Complications during delivery, medical error, negligence from the team I knew who were my colleagues." She turned to Edward, her eyes shining with held-back tears. "I screamed, begged, said something was wrong, but no one listened to me because I was in labor, because I was hysterical." Edward felt a knot in his stomach, beginning to understand the magnitude of what Mary had hidden. When John died 3 days later, the investigation showed that if the team had listened to me, if they had done a C-section, when I asked, he would be alive. Mary wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But who would believe a nurse against 3 renowned doctors? "My God, Mary," Edward murmured. "I couldn't step foot in a hospital after that. The memories, the smells, the sounds, everything reminded me that I had failed, as a mother, as a professional, as a woman." Mary sat down in a chair next to the stroller. "So I left everything and came here. I thought that by being just a cook, just another invisible employee, I could forget." Edward watched Mary with an expression that mixed shock, understanding, and something that could be respect. "Why didn't you ever tell us this?" "Because who would hire a nurse who let her own child die?" Mary replied with brutal honesty. "And because I wanted to prove that I could start over, that I could be useful in other ways." "But Mary," Edward stood up, walking toward her, "you didn't let your child die. You did everything you could." "Did I? Then why couldn't I save him?" Mary looked at Edward with a pain so deep that he had to look away. At that moment, Isabella appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the voices. "What's going on here?" Edward looked at his wife, then at Mary, and made a decision. "Isa, sit down. There's something you need to know about Mary." In the next 15 minutes, while Gabriel slept peacefully in his stroller, the truth unfolded like a rug that had been folded in a dark corner for months. Isabella listened in silence, her eyes filling with tears as Mary recounted her story about John. "So you knew," Isabella said when Mary finished speaking. "You knew what Gabriel had from the beginning?" Mary nodded, slowly. "When I saw the symptoms, the refusal to eat, the pattern of crying, I recognized it. I had seen a few cases at the hospital. But who would believe a cook saying she knew the diagnosis?" Edward ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of months of misdirected pride. "That's why you offered your milk so quickly. You knew it was the only solution." "I knew that if I didn't do something quickly, Gabriel would end up like—" Mary didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. Isabella stood up and, to her surprise, everyone, including herself, hugged. "Mary, thank you. Not just for saving Ethan, but for enduring our ignorance all these months." Mary returned the hug, feeling something break inside her. a barrier she had built around her heart since John's death. Edward watched the two women embrace beside the crib where his son slept, protected by the knowledge and dedication of someone he had treated like a servant for months. For the first time since Ethan was born, he felt truly small. "Mary," Edward said when they separated, "I owe you an apology. Many apologies." "You don't need to, Mr. Edward. You gave me a chance to start over, but you gave us so much more." Isabella looked at Ethan, then at Mary. "You taught us a lesson in humility." Ethan chose that moment to wake up, opening his eyes and instinctively searching for Mary. She leaned over the crib, and the baby smiled, the first conscious smile he had ever given. "Hi, my little angel," Mary murmured, picking Ethan up. "Did you wake up hungry?" As Edward watched Mary prepare to feed Ethan with the natural expertise of someone who had done this professionally for years, he realized that everything made sense now. The tenderness with which she handled the baby, the instinctive knowledge of his needs, the calm during crises. All of it came from an experience she had hidden to protect her own broken heart. "Mary," Edward said as she headed toward the room where she usually nursed Ethan, "from now on, I want you to know that you are not just our employee. You are part of the family." Mary paused at the door. Ethan nestled in her arms and looked at Edward with an expression that mixed surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Edward. But I always knew I was part of the family. From the first day Ethan nursed at my breast, he became my son too, and you, whether you wanted to or not, became my family." And with those words, Mary left the kitchen, leaving Edward and Isabella alone with a new understanding of the extraordinary woman who had saved not only their son's life, but perhaps the soul of their family. It was early June, and the mornings in Brooklyn were starting to get cooler, announcing the arrival of winter. Ethan, now 3.5 months old, had become a chubby, smiling baby who responded to stimuli with the liveliness of a healthy child. But it was on a rainy Tuesday that something unexpected happened, something that would change the dynamics of the house in a way no one could foresee. Mary was in the kitchen preparing afternoon tea when she decided to do something different. The light rain falling over Brooklyn had made her nostalgic, reminding her of rainy afternoons at her grandmother's house in rural New Jersey. Almost without thinking, she opened the cabinet where she kept her few personal belongings and took out a small bag of fennel seeds she had brought from her hometown. "I'll make a little tea like my grandma used to," she murmured to herself, putting water to boil. The aroma that began to spread through the kitchen was sweet and comforting, filled with memories of a simple but happy childhood. Mary didn't expect that this simple act of preparing tea could have such a profound impact on the Morgan household. Ethan, who was in the stroller near the counter, began to make soft, cooing sounds of contentment. It wasn't feeding time, but the baby seemed especially calm, his little eyes sparkling, as he followed Mary's movements around the kitchen. "Do you like the smell, my angel?" Mary smiled at him, stirring the steaming tea. "My grandma used to say that fennel calms any child, and by the looks of it, she was right." It was at that moment that Isabella appeared in the kitchen, drawn by the unusual aroma. She had spent the morning trying to respond to comments on her social media, a task that had become increasingly difficult since her life had changed so much. "What a lovely smell," Isabella asked, approaching the counter where Mary was preparing the tea. "Fennel, Mrs. Isabella. Tea that my grandma made when I was little." Mary served the tea in a porcelain cup she had found in the cabinet. "Would you like to try?" Isabella hesitated for a moment. In the months of living together, she and Mary had developed a relationship of mutual respect, especially after the revelation about the cook's medical training. But sharing homemade tea still felt like breaking a barrier that Isabella wasn't sure she was ready to cross. "Why not?" Isabella finally said, sitting on the stool at the counter. As the two women sipped tea, in comfortable silence, the rain continued to patter against the large windows. Ethan had fallen asleep in the stroller, lulled by the aroma and the unusual tranquility that hung in the kitchen. "You know, Mary," Isabella began, turning the cup between her hands, "I never asked you about your family. What's your hometown like?" Mary smiled, her eyes lighting up with memories. "It's very different from here, Mrs. Isabella. A small town where everyone knows each other. My grandma had a small house with a yard full of herbs and medicinal plants." "And your mother? Does she still live there?" "Yes, she does. She and my father have a small farm where they grow vegetables to sell in town." Mary took a sip of her tea. "They were a bit lost when I decided to come to New York. They never understood why a trained nurse would want to work as a cook." Isabella watched Mary speak, noticing how her face transformed when she talked about her family. There was a lightness there that she rarely saw in the daily life of the house. "Do they know about John?" Mary lowered her eyes to the cup. "They do. It was my mother who convinced me to leave home after he died. She said I needed to find a new purpose, or I would end up dying of sadness along with him." "And did you find it? Your new purpose?" Mary looked in the direction of Ethan, who was sleeping peacefully. "I think so, even though I didn't plan for it." At that moment, Edward came home early from work, surprised to find his wife and the caregiver chatting in the kitchen like two friends. The aroma of fennel hit him as soon as he entered, bringing a distant memory of his own childhood. "What is that smell?" Edward asked, loosening his tie. "Mary made some tea," Isabella replied. "Want to try?" Edward looked at the two women sitting at the counter, at his son sleeping peacefully in the stroller, and had a strange feeling that he was seeing his family in a different light. "Why not?" he said, surprising himself. Mary poured a third cup, and Edward sat down next to his wife. For a few minutes the three sat in silence, sipping the tea, while the rain created a cozy atmosphere that the luxurious apartment had never provided before. "You know, this reminds me of my grandma's house," Edward said suddenly, surprising both women. "She also made fennel tea when I was a kid." "You had a grandma who made tea?" Mary asked with genuine interest. "I did. Grandma Mary." Edward smiled at the memory. "Funny, she had the same name as you. She lived in a simple house in a quaint neighborhood before it became trendy." Isabella looked at her husband in surprise. In 5 years of marriage, she had never heard him speak fondly of his childhood. Edward always presented himself as someone who had been born successful, as if his life journey had started straight in business school. "She passed away when I was in college," Edward continued. "I always thought her homemade recipes were old-fashioned, lacking sophistication. I never had fennel tea again after that." "And how is it having it again?" Mary asked gently. Edward paused for a moment. "It's like going back in time, remembering when things were simpler." Ethan woke up at that moment, making his soft baby noises. Mary got up to pick him up, and when he saw the 3 adults gathered around the counter, he gave a wide smile that melted their hearts. "Look how happy he is," Isabella commented. "It's like he knows we're all okay." "Babies sense the energy of their surroundings," Mary said, gently rocking Ethan. "When the adults are calm, they stay calm too." Edward looked around the kitchen, at his wife, more relaxed than he had seen her in months, at Mary, smiling genuinely, at his son in the arms of someone who had become much more than just a caregiver. The aroma of fennel still lingered in the air, creating a homely atmosphere that his luxurious apartment had never had. "Mary," Edward said suddenly, "do you have more of that fennel?" "I do, sir. I brought a handful from my grandma's house." "How about you make that tea more often? Maybe it would be good for all of us." Mary smiled. understanding that this was more than a request about tea. It was an invitation for her to bring more of her essence into that house, to transform that cold space into something more like a home. "Of course, Mr. Edward. And if you'd like, I can teach you some recipes my grandma used to make. Simple things that make the house smell like family." Isabella stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain begin to lessen. "You know what? I've always wanted childhood memories like the ones you're talking about. The smell of Grandma's house, family recipes." "You don't have any?" Mary asked in surprise. "No, my parents were always very busy with work. I grew up more with nannies and housekeepers than with them." Isabella turned to Mary. Maybe you could teach me some things, so when Ethan grows up he can have those memories you both have." Edward watched his wife make that request and felt something shift in his chest. Perhaps it was the first time he saw Isabella admit a vulnerability, a desire to be different from what she had always been. "It would be a pleasure, Mrs. Isabella," Mary replied warmly. "And who knows, maybe Ethan will grow up knowing he has 3 people who love him, each in their own way." When the rain stopped and the sun began to peek through the clouds, the 3 adults were still in the kitchen, talking about recipes, memories, and plans to make the house a more welcoming place. Ethan had nursed and fallen asleep again, cradled not only by Mary's milk, but by the unusual harmony that lingered in the air. That day, something fundamental changed in the Morgan household. The aroma of fennel had done more than scent the environment. It had opened a door for 3 very different people to discover that perhaps they could form something resembling a real family. July arrived with the typical chill of Chicago's winter, and with it came news that would shake the delicate balance that had been established in the Morgan household. It was on a Thursday morning that Mary's phone rang during breakfast, interrupting the peaceful routine that had become precious to everyone. Ethan was in Isabella's lap, playing with a colorful pacifier while waiting for the next feeding time. In recent months, the relationship between the 2 women had evolved from a respectful coexistence to something approaching true friendship. "Mary, your phone is ringing," Isabella announced, watching the cook prepare oatmeal with cinnamon, yet another recipe she had brought from her family memories. Mary dried her hands on her apron and answered the phone with some apprehension. Calls to her personal cell were rare, especially early in the morning. "Hello? Yes, it's me." Mary's expression gradually changed as she listened. Her eyes widened, then narrowed with concentration. "When? Are you sure?" She stepped back a few paces, lowering her voice. "I need to think. Can I call back tomorrow?" When she hung up the phone, Maria stood still for a few seconds, staring at the device as if it had just announced the end of the world. "Are you okay, Maria?" Isabella asked, noticing the paleness on the cook's face. Maria looked at Isabella, then at Ethan, and sat heavily in a chair. "It was from the Children's Hospital of Chicago, one of the best in the country." "Hospital? Did something happen to your family?" "No, Mrs. Isabella. They are offering me a job as head nurse in the neonatal intensive care unit." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Ethan playing with his pacifier. Isabella felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. "How did they know you are a nurse?" Isabella asked, although she suspected the answer. "Dr. Smith. He knows the director of the hospital and told her about my situation. He said it was a waste for me not to be practicing my profession." Maria ran her hand over her face. "The salary it's 3 times what I earn here, and I would go back to doing what I've always loved." At that moment, Edward entered the kitchen already dressed for work, but stopped abruptly upon sensing the tension in the air. "What's going on?" he asked, looking from one to the other. Isabella quickly recounted the call, and Edward felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Over the past few months, he had grown accustomed not only to the medical dependency Ethan had on Maria, but also to her presence in their home. She had become an anchor of stability in their lives. "Chicago?" Edward repeated. "Maria, that means you would have to move." "Yes, Mr. Edward, and start next week." "Next week?" Isabella almost shouted, startling Ethan. "But Maria, Ethan still needs you. Dr. Smith said it would be at least until he's 6 months old." "I know, Mrs. Isabella. That's why I need to think." Maria looked at Ethan, who had stopped playing and seemed to sense the adult's tension. "It's the opportunity of my professional life." But what?" Edward asked, his voice laden with an urgency he couldn't disguise. "But it means leaving you all. Leaving Ethan." Maria extended her arms to the baby, who immediately leaned toward her. "I don't know if I can do this." Edward began to pace back and forth in the kitchen, his practical mind trying to find a solution. "How much are they offering? I can double your salary here." "Mr. Edward, it's not about the money." Maria gently rocked Ethan. "It's about being who I've always been, about practicing my profession." "But you practice your profession here," Isabella protested. "You take care of Ethan better than any hospital nurse." "Taking care of Ethan is different. Here I am. I am a borrowed mother. There, I would be a recognized professional, saving real lives." Maria's words hit Isabella like a slap. "A borrowed mother? Is that how you see yourself?" Maria realized she had unintentionally hurt Isabella. "No, Mrs. Isabella, that's not what I meant. Here I feel at home, but it's not your home." Edward completed, finally understanding the delicate position Maria was in. "Is that what you're trying to say?" Maria nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "No matter how well you treat me, no matter how much I love Ethan as if he were my son, I know I am the employee. And when Ethan no longer needs me—" "Do you think we would let you go?" Isabella asked, genuinely shocked. "I don't know, Mrs. Isabella. You are good people, but you are wealthy people, and wealthy people have other priorities when things change." Maria's comment created an uncomfortable silence. Edward and Isabella exchanged glances, realizing that despite all the months of living together, there was still a class barrier they had not fully crossed. "Maria," Edward said, sitting down at the kitchen table, "I know we have no right to ask you to turn down an opportunity like this, but I need you to know that you are not just an employee to us." "What am I, then?" Maria asked, a genuine question that left Edward momentarily speechless. "You are family," Isabella replied. "You saved our son, taught us things we didn't know we needed to learn. You turned this house into a home." "Family," Maria repeated the word as if testing its flavor. "Mrs. Isabella, family doesn't get paid to stay." Ethan chose that moment to start crying, asking for his morning feeding. Maria stood up automatically, but Isabella stopped her with a gesture. "Let me try," Isabella said, picking up the baby. For a few minutes, Isabella tried to calm Ethan, humming softly, rocking him, offering affection, but the baby continued to cry, instinctively reaching for Maria. "He only calms down with me," Maria said sadly. "And this will last for a few more months. I can't leave you like this." "But you also can't give up your life for us," Edward said, surprising both women with his honesty. "Maria, if you stay here only out of obligation, out of pity, it won't be good for anyone." "I don't stay out of pity," Maria replied firmly. "I stay because I love you all, the three of you." The declaration hung in the air like a confession no one expected. Maria had voiced what everyone felt, but no one dared to verbalize. "Then stay," Isabella pleaded, her voice almost a whisper. "Please, stay." Maria looked at Ethan, who had stopped crying the moment he heard her voice. She looked at Isabella with pleading eyes. She looked at Edward, who for the first time in months seemed truly vulnerable. "I need some time to think," Maria finally said. "It's a very big decision to make all at once." "How much time do you have to respond?" Edward asked. "Until tomorrow afternoon." Edward nodded. "Then let's give that time." Mary took a moment, but she wanted Edward to know that whatever her decision, she would always have a place here. Not as an employee, but as part of their family. Mary smiled through her tears, picked up Ethan and left the kitchen for the bedroom where she used to nurse him. Edward and Isabella were left alone, facing the possibility that the woman who had become essential to their lives might leave in a week. "What if she leaves?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling. Edward looked out the window, watching the grey July morning. "Then we'll have to learn to be a family without her, and hope that she is happy." But as he spoke those words, Edward knew that Mary's departure would be much more than the loss of a caregiver for Ethan. It would be the loss of someone who had taught them all the true meaning of unconditional love. It was the eve of the 4th of July when Mary made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. After a sleepless night contemplating the hospital's proposal, she woke up with a fixed idea. If this could be her last week in the Morgan household, she wanted to leave a special memory. "Mrs. Isabella," Mary said during breakfast, while Ethan nursed peacefully in her arms, "would you mind if I threw a small 4th of July party tonight? Nothing too elaborate, just a tradition from my hometown." Isabella, who had spent the night awake imagining what the house would be like without Mary, looked at the cook in surprise. "A party? Here in the penthouse?" "On the balcony, just for us. I can make some typical foods, decorate a little." Mary hesitated. "It's just that I need to give my answer to the hospital tomorrow, and I wanted you to know a little more about where I come from." Edward, who was sipping his coffee while reading emails on his tablet, looked up. In recent days, he had become more attentive to Mary's wishes, as if each of her gestures could be the last. "Of course, Mary, do whatever you want. Do you need money to buy anything?" he offered. "No, Mr. Edward, I already have everything I need." Mary smiled, but there was a melancholy in her eyes that did not go unnoticed by either of them. Throughout the morning, Mary worked with an energy she hadn't shown in weeks. She went down to a local market in Brooklyn and returned loaded with bags of corn, peanuts, coconut, brown sugar, and other ingredients that Isabella had never seen in her gourmet kitchen. "What is all this?" Isabella asked, watching Mary pour the ingredients onto the granite countertop. "Corn pudding, sweet corn pudding, peanut brittle, hot spice cider," Mary listed, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "And I'm going to make that green corn soup my grandmother used to make. Ethan will love the smell." Isabella watched Mary work, noticing how her movements in the kitchen changed when she prepared foods from her hometown. There was a gracefulness there, a connection to something ancestral that made cooking more than just preparing food. "Can I help?" Isabella offered, surprising herself. "Of course, Mrs. Isabella. You can grate the corn for the corn pudding." For the first time since moving into that penthouse, Isabella spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen, her hands dirty with corn and sugar, learning recipes that her maid had inherited from generations of native women. Ethan stayed in his stroller nearby, watching the two women work together in a harmony that he was too young to understand, but certainly felt. When Edward arrived home from work at 7 in the evening, he stopped at the entrance of the living room in total shock. The balcony of the penthouse had been transformed into something he never imagined possible in that sophisticated space. Colorful paper. Bunting was strung from one end of the balcony to the other. Candles in glass jars created a soft, cozy glow. In the center, Mary had improvised a small bonfire using a brazier she found in the storage room, and the aroma of roasted corn mingled with the smell of typical foods arranged on platters on a table covered with a checkered tablecloth. "My God," Edward murmured, watching Isabella appear on the balcony carrying Ethan, both dressed more casually than usual. Surprised, Isabella smiled, and Edward noticed something different about his wife. She seemed lighter, more natural. Mary appeared carrying a tray with steaming hot spiced cider. She had changed from her navy blue uniform into a floral skirt and a simple white blouse she had brought from her hometown. Her hair was loose, framing her face in a way that made her look younger and carefree. "Welcome to our 4th of July party, Mr. Edward," Mary said, offering him a mug of hot spiced cider. Edward accepted the drink and took a sip, feeling the warmth of the cider mixed with ginger, cloves and cinnamon go down his throat and warm his body on a surprisingly cold July night. "It's delicious," he said, realizing that his words were insufficient to describe what he was feeling. Over the next few hours, something magical happened on that balcony. Mary connected her phone to a speaker and played folk music, songs that spoke of love, longing, and simple life in the countryside. She taught Edward and Isabella how to dance, laughing when they stepped on her feet, applauding when they managed to get a few steps right. Ethan, fed and content, remained in the arms of one or the other, watching the adults with bright eyes, as if he knew that this night was special. "Try the corn pudding," Mary insisted, serving pieces of the sweet delicacy she had made during the afternoon. Isabella tasted it, and her eyes widened. "Mary, this is divine. How did you learn to make it?" "My grandmother taught me when I was 7. She said every native woman needs to know how to make corn pudding to be happy." Mary smiled, but Edward noticed a shadow of sadness. Maria looked up at the stars, her thoughts drifting. "Are you happy?" Edward suddenly asked, surprising everyone with the personal question. Maria stopped eating, looked at Ethan in her arms, then at Isabella and Edward sitting on the porch floor, enjoying corn pudding and hot spiced cider as if they were simple folks at a country fair. "At this moment, yes, I am happy," she replied. "Happier than I have been in a long time." "Then why are you thinking of leaving?" Isabella asked, her voice heavy with an emotion she couldn't hide. Maria was silent for a few seconds, gently rocking Ethan. "Because temporary happiness is not enough to build a life." "Who said it would be temporary?" Edward asked. "Mr. Edward, you are wonderful. People, but I know how the world works. When Ethan grows up, when he no longer needs me, you will want a younger, more modern employee. And I will be 40, with no professional prospects." "Maria," Isabella moved closer to her. "Do you really think we are that superficial?" "It's not superficiality, Mrs. Isabella. It's reality. You live in a world that I have only visited. One day, the visit ends." Edward stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking at the city lights below. Maria's words hit him like a slap, because he knew there was truth in them. "Maria," he said, not turning around, "what would it take for you to believe you have a permanent place in our lives?" "I don't know, Mr. Edward. Honestly, I don't know." Ethan chose that moment to give a wide smile and clap his hands, as if applauding the party. The 3 adults laughed, and the tension of the moment temporarily dissolved. "Shall we dance a little more?" Maria suggested, placing Ethan in the stroller and turning up the music. This time, Edward danced with Maria while Isabella held Ethan. The song was Asa Branca by Luis Gonzaga, and Maria hummed softly as she moved in Edward's arms with a naturalness that surprised him. "When I saw the land burning like a 4th of July bonfire," Maria sang, and her voice had a melancholic quality that made Edward understand the song was about longing, about leaving one's homeland in search of something better. "Is it about you?" Edward asked softly. "It's about all of us who left home looking for a better life," Maria replied. "Sometimes we find it, sometimes we don't." When the music ended, they remained embraced for a few seconds longer than would be appropriate between employer and employee. But that night, there were no employers or employees. There were just three people who had discovered how important they were to one another. "Maria," Isabella said when they separated, "regardless of what you decide tomorrow, thank you for this night, for showing us how beautiful a simpler life can be." Maria smiled, wiping away a tear that insisted on falling. "Thank you for letting me share a little of my story with you." When the party ended and they were gathering the decorations, Edward made a decision. "Maria, I want to make a proposal, not as your employer, but as someone who cares about you." Maria stopped folding the flags and looked at him attentively. "Don't respond to the hospital tomorrow. Give me 1 more week. Let me see if I can find a way to make you believe you have a future here with us." Maria looked at Isabella, who nodded encouragingly, then at Ethan, who was peacefully sleeping in the stroller. "1 week?" she asked. "1 week," Edward confirmed. "All right. 1 more week." And as Maria collected the last remnants of the 4th of July celebration, she had no idea that Edward was already planning something that would change not only her perspective on the future, but the entire dynamic of their lives. The promised week from Edward was on its 5th day when he returned home carrying a bulky folder and an expression that mixed nervousness and determination. It was a rainy July afternoon, and Maria was in the living room with Ethan, who could now sit with support and was observing everything around him with the growing curiosity of a nearly 5-month-old baby. "Isabella, Maria, can you come here in the living room? I need to talk to you about something important," Edward said, placing the folder on the marble coffee table. Isabella came out of the office where she had been trying to record a video for her social media, a task that had become increasingly difficult since her real life had become more interesting than her virtual life. She immediately noticed the tension in her husband's shoulders. "What happened?" Isabella asked, sitting on the sofa next to Maria, who was holding Ethan in her lap. Edward took a deep breath and opened the folder, revealing several documents, old photos and papers that looked official. "In the last few weeks since we learned about Maria's background, I hired a private investigator." "A private investigator?" Maria straightened up, alarmed. "For what?" "To better understand your story, to make sure that—" Edward paused, realizing how his words sounded. "It wasn't out of distrust, Maria. It was out of curiosity. And what I discovered, well, it changed everything." Isabella looked at the documents spread out on the table, noticing that some seemed very old, like certificates and black-and-white photos. "Edward, what story is this?" she asked. Edward picked up an old photo and showed it to the two women. It was a black-and-white image of a young woman with delicate features holding a baby in her arms. "This is Helen Smith, your grandmother Maria," Edward said, watching the cook's reaction. "How did you get this photo?" Maria asked, taking the image with trembling hands. "I didn't even know it existed." "It was difficult to obtain. I had to hire researchers in New Jersey, look in old registries." Edward picked up another document. "But what I discovered is extraordinary, Maria. Your grandmother was not just a housewife from the countryside." Maria looked at Edward in confusion. "What do you mean?" Edward showed a birth certificate. Helen Smith was the daughter of John Smith, who was one of the largest shareholders of a mining company in the 1950s. "This can't be right," Maria shook her head. "My grandma was a simple woman. She lived in a small house, tended to her garden." "Because she chose to live that way," Edward continued, picking up more documents. When your grandfather died in 1960, Helen inherited a considerable fortune, but there are records showing that she donated almost everything to orphanages and hospitals, keeping only a small farm. Isabella watched Maria process the information, seeing how the discovery was shaking her certainties about her own family. "But Edward," Isabella interjected, "what does this have to do with the current situation?" Edward smiled, picking up a more recent document. "It has to do with this. Maria, your grandma didn't donate everything. She created a trust fund that grew over decades, a fund that today is worth approximately $8 million. The silence in the room was absolute. Ethan, oblivious to the magnitude of the revelation, played with Maria's fingers, who was paralyzed in shock. "8 million?" Maria repeated, her voice coming out as a whisper. "And there's more." Edward picked up another paper. "My company, Morgan Cosmetics, was founded with initial investment from a group of anonymous shareholders in the 1980s. I could never trace who they were because everything was done through intermediaries." Maria looked at Edward with growing confusion. And one of those investors was your grandma's fund. Maria, your family is technically a minority shareholder in the company that made me rich." The revelation hit Maria like a tsunami. She looked at Ethan, then at Isabella, then at Edward, trying to process that her entire life had been built on a misunderstanding of her own origins. "Are you saying that—" Maria couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm saying that you are not a poor cook who depends on this job to survive. You are an heiress who chose to live simply." Edward sat down in the armchair across from the sofa, "and who, ironically, helped finance the company that supports our family." Isabella was speechless. "Maria, did you know anything about this?" "Nothing," Maria replied, still in shock. "My grandma never talked about money. She always lived simply, teaching the family to value honest work, not wealth." Edward picked up the last document from the folder. "There's one more thing, Maria. The hospital that offered you the job in Chicago, they discovered your true story, too. The offer wasn't just because of your competence. It was because they know you can fund new equipment for the neonatal intensive care unit." Maria abruptly stood up, nearly knocking over Ethan. She walked to the panoramic window, looking at the city below as if she were seeing it for the first time. "Why did you do this investigation, Edward?" she asked, not turning around. "Because I wanted to find a way to convince you to stay. I thought if I offered you a partner position in the company, you would feel more secure about the future." "Partner?" Maria turned around, an expression of disbelief on her face. "Technically, you already are. But I'm offering to increase your share, to give you an active role in the company." Edward stood up as well. "I want you to be responsible for the children's product line, to use your medical expertise to develop truly safe cosmetics for babies." Isabella watched the conversation with fascination, realizing that her husband had carefully planned all of this. "You are trying to buy me," Maria said, her voice coming out harsher than usual. "No!" Edward protested. "We are trying to show you that you have options, that you can choose to stay or leave, but that any choice will be by your own will, not out of necessity." Maria returned to the sofa and picked up Ethan, finding comfort in the familiarity of the gesture. The baby smiled at her, completely unaware of the complexity of the situation. $8 million, Maria repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. "And growing," Edward confirmed. "Your grandma was very wise to create that fund." "You know what's more ironic?" Maria looked at Edward with an expression that mixed sadness and understanding. "She always told me that true wealth doesn't come from money. It comes from the love you give and receive." "And she was right," Isabella said softly. Look at what happened here. You came as our employee, but you became part of our family. That is priceless." Maria remained silent for a long time, rocking Ethan and thinking. The revelation about her inheritance changed everything, and at the same time changed nothing. She still loved that family. She still wanted to care for Ethan. She still felt at home in that luxurious penthouse. "Edward," she finally said, "if I accept your proposal, if I become your partner, how does that work? Do I continue living here?" "As you wish. You can have your own house, your own space. Or you can stay here, not as an employee, but as—" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "As family," Isabella completed. Maria looked at both of them, then at Ethan, who had fallen asleep in her arms. "I need to call my mother. I need to understand why she never told me about Grandma's inheritance." "Of course." Edward nodded. "But Maria, does this change your decision about the hospital in Chicago?" Maria smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "It changed everything, Edward. Absolutely everything." And as she left the room carrying Ethan to the bedroom, Edward and Isabella were left alone, with the certainty that they had just discovered that the woman they loved as family was, literally, part of the family business that supported them. Fate sometimes has a peculiar sense of humor. 3 weeks had passed since the revelation about Maria's inheritance, and the dynamics of the house had changed subtly, but significantly. Maria still cared for Ethan with the same dedication, but now there was a different confidence in her posture, the security of someone who knows. It was a morning in August when Dr. Smith arrived for Ethan's monthly appointment, but this time he was not alone. He had brought with him Dr. Sarah Roberts, a pediatric geneticist from the National Institute of Medical Genetics. "Edward, Isabella, this is Dr. Sarah." Dr. Smith made the introductions in the room where Ethan was playing on the rug under Maria's watchful eyes. "I asked her to come because Ethan's latest tests showed some markers that deserve special attention." Maria stood up automatically, picking Ethan up in a protective motion that had become instinctive. "Is there a problem with him?" Dr. Roberts, a woman in her 40s with grey hair and delicate glasses, smiled reassuringly. "Not exactly a problem, Maria, but rather a condition that explains a lot about why Ethan has such specific needs." Edward stepped closer, the concern evident on his face. "What kind of condition?" "Ethan has a rare genetic mutation called congenital lactase deficiency." Dr. Roberts opened a folder with test results. "It's different from common lactose intolerance. It's a condition that affects approximately 1 in every 500,000 children." Isabella felt her legs weaken. Is it serious?" "It's not fatal, but it is permanent," the geneticist explained. "Ethan's body does not produce certain enzymes necessary to process specific components of milk, not just lactose, but also some proteins and amino acids." Maria gently rocked Ethan, sensing he was becoming restless, as if he could feel the tension of the adults. "And what does this mean for him?" "It means he will need specific dietary care for the rest of his life," Dr. Smith replied. "He won't be able to consume conventional dairy, and many processed foods will be problematic." "But doctor," Edward interjected, "Ethan eats perfectly well with Maria. How is that possible?" Dr. Roberts smiled, looking at Maria with professional respect. "That's the most interesting part. Maria, can you tell me about your diet, especially in the last few months?" Maria hesitated, not understanding where the question was leading. "Well, I have always eaten naturally. Lots of vegetables, fruits, fish. I avoid processed foods since I was a child. And do you take any supplements? Specific vitamins?" "I take a vitamin complex that my mother always gave me. It's made with medicinal herbs that my grandma cultivated," Maria replied. "Why?" The geneticist picked up another paper from the tests. Because your natural diet and supplementation have created a nutritional profile in your milk that is exactly what Ethan needs. It's as if your body is producing a customized formula for him. The silence in the room was profound. Isabella looked at Maria as if she were witnessing a miracle. "Are you saying that Maria is the only person who can adequately feed Ethan?" Edward asked. "Not the only one, but certainly the most compatible we have found," Dr. Roberts replied. "It would be possible to create a synthetic formula, but it would be extremely expensive and less effective." Maria sat heavily on the sofa, Ethan still in her arms. "For how long?" "Ethan will need compatible breast milk until at least 18 months, Dr. Smith explained. "After that, we can introduce specific solid foods, but he will always need specialized nutritional monitoring." 18 months? Isabella repeated, doing mental calculations. "That means another whole year. And there's more." Dr. Roberts picked up another document. "Ethan's condition is hereditary. If you have other children, there is a 25% chance they will be born with the same condition." The information hit Isabella like a bolt of lightning. She had spent the previous week wondering if she should try to get pregnant again, especially now that Ethan was healthy and the family situation had stabilized. 25%, Edward repeated. "Is that a high chance?" "It's significant," the geneticist confirmed. "But now that we know about the condition, any future pregnancy can be monitored and care can be planned in advance." Maria watched Ethan, who had returned to playing quietly in her lap, oblivious to the fact that his genetic condition was redefining the future of the entire family. "Dr. Roberts," Maria said, her voice calm but determined, "is there any way to train other people to produce the type of milk that Ethan needs?" "Theoretically, yes. With a very specific diet and controlled supplementation, another lactating woman could develop a similar nutritional profile," the doctor replied. "But it would be a long and complex process." Edward looked at Maria, then at Isabella. "Maria, do you understand what this means?" "It means I need to stay," Maria replied simply. "For Ethan's sake, I need to stay." "It's not just for Ethan," Isabella said, surprising everyone. "If we decide to have other children, we will need you too." The statement created a new silence in the room. The possibility of future children with the same condition transformed Maria's presence from temporary to essential in the long term. "Isabella," Dr. Smith said gently, "you don't need to make this decision now. But it's important to understand that Ethan's condition is not something he will overcome. It's a permanent characteristic." Maria stood up and walked to the window, still holding Ethan. "You understand that this changes everything, right? It's no longer about choosing between a job here or in Chicago. It's about making a lifelong commitment." "And are you willing to do that?" Edward asked, approaching her. Maria looked at Ethan, who lifted his little eyes to her and smiled. "Mr. Edward, from the first day I breastfed this boy, I knew he had become my son too, now discovering that I might be the only person who can care for him properly." She paused, organizing her thoughts. "It's not even a matter of choice. It's destiny." Dr. Roberts put the papers back in the folder. "Maria, may I make a suggestion? Given your nursing background and your unique experience with Ethan, would you consider specializing in pediatric nutrition for rare genetic conditions? There are few professionals in this area in the United States." Maria looked at the geneticist with interest. "What do you mean?" "You, Mary, could help other families facing similar situations. Her practical experience is invaluable." Edward moved closer. "Mary, this could be part of your work at the company. We could create a research and development department for specialized pediatric nutrition." Isabella observed the conversation, realizing how what had started as a medical crisis was transforming into an opportunity to give Mary professional purpose while keeping Ethan safe. "Are you suggesting I become a specialist in children like Ethan?" Mary asked. "We are suggesting you become the best specialist in this area in the country," Edward replied, "and use our company as a base to help other families." Ethan chose that moment to make a sound of contentment, as if approving the idea. The four adults laughed, and the tension of the morning began to dissolve. "Dr. Smith," Mary asked, "how many children in the country have the same condition as Ethan?" "We estimate there are about 400 diagnosed cases, but there are likely many more without a correct diagnosis." 400 families going through what you went through," Mary said to Edward and Isabella. 400 children who may not be receiving the proper care. Edward immediately understood where Mary was headed. "And you want to help all of them?" "I do," Mary confirmed. "If I'm going to be here for the next few years taking care of Ethan, it should be doing something greater as well." Dr. Smith smiled. "Well, it seems we've found the solution to several problems at once." When the doctors left, the family was left alone with a new understanding of the future. Ethan was not just a baby needing temporary special care. He was the beginning of a journey that would lead them to create something greater, a support network for families facing similar challenges. "Mary," Isabella said as they were preparing lunch together, "are you sure you want to commit to all of this? 18 months is a long time." Mary looked at Ethan, who was playing in the stroller nearby. "Mrs. Isabella, when my John died, I thought I would never have purpose in life again. Now I find out I can care not only for Ethan, but for hundreds of other children like him." She paused, stirring the soup she was making. 18 months is not a long time. It's enough time to build something that will last forever. It was a September morning when the world of the Morgans was shaken by the latest and most shocking revelation. Ethan would turn 6 months old the following week, and the household routine had settled into a harmony that seemed almost too perfect to last. It was when Isabella decided to organize the personal documents for the registration of the new company that she and Edward had created with Mary that the truth came to light. Mary was in the living room playing with Ethan, who could now sit up on his own and babble sounds that resembled Mama and Papa, when Isabella appeared in the office doorway with an expression that mixed shock, confusion, and something that could be anger. "Mary, can you come here?" Isabella called, her voice tense. "Edward, too. It's urgent." Mary picked up Ethan and headed to the office, where she found Edward already waiting, clearly concerned about his wife's expression. The table was covered with documents, certificates, and papers that Isabella had spread out as if assembling a puzzle. "What happened?" Edward asked, observing the organized chaos on the table. "I was organizing the documents for the new company when I decided to check some information about Mary's family," Isabella said, her voice controlled but tense. "To complete the partner registration, I needed complete genealogical data." Mary felt a knot in her stomach. "Is there a problem with my documents?" "Not with your documents." Isabella picked up an old birth certificate and placed it next to a more recent one. "But with mine." Edward moved closer to the table, studying the papers. "Isabella, what did you find?" "I found this." Isabella showed 2 certificates side by side. "My father's birth certificate, Anthony Smith, born in New Jersey in 1965, and the birth certificate of Mary's father, Anthony Smith, born in New Jersey in 1965. The silence in the office was absolute. Ethan made a soft sound, oblivious to the earthquake that had just shaken the foundations of the family. "This must be a coincidence," Mary murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's a common name." "I thought the same thing." Isabella picked up another certificate, until I found this, the marriage certificate of Anthony Smith to two different women, to your mother Mary Grace in 1989 and to my mother Patricia Smith in 1995. Edward looked from the certificates to the two women, trying to process the information. Isabella, are you saying that... I'm saying that Mary and I are sisters, Isabella said, her voice now trembling. Half-sisters, but sisters. Mary sat heavily in the office chair, Ethan still in her arms. The revelation explained so many things, the immediate connection she had felt with the family, the ease with which Ethan had adapted to her, the sense of belonging she had never been able to explain. My father, Mary began, but couldn't finish the sentence. Our father, Isabella corrected, sitting in the other chair. A man who maintained two families in different cities for years. Edward walked to the window, trying to organize his thoughts. This explains why Ethan adapted so well to Mary. You are from the same family. It explains much more than that. Isabella picked up another document. It explains why Mary's milk is so compatible with Ethan. It explains why she has such strong instincts regarding him. It explains why I always felt connected to her in a way I didn't understand. Mary looked at Isabella as if seeing her for the first time. How long have you known? I found out last night. I spent the whole night checking documents, calling registries, verifying dates. Isabella wiped away a tear that insisted on falling. Our father died. 5 years, Mary, in a car accident in Chicago. I know, Mary said softly. I was at the funeral, but I didn't see you there. Because I was in Paris, I didn't even know he had died. Until weeks later. Isabella stood up and began to walk around the office. My mom told me he had gone on a business trip. I only found out the truth when the lawyers contacted me about inheritance issues. Edward moved closer to the two women. Mary, does your mom know about the other family? She always knew, Mary replied. Mom knew that Dad was married to another woman. They met after his marriage to your mother. She looked at Isabella. Mom always told me that love doesn't choose circumstances, but that I should understand my position in life. Your position? Isabella stopped walking. Mary, you were his daughter just as much as I was. But you were the legitimate daughter, the heiress. Mary replied with a simplicity that broke Isabella's heart. I was the secret he visited on weekends. Ethan chose that moment to stretch his little arms toward Isabella, as if he knew she needed to hold him. Mary handed the baby to Isabella, and the two women looked at each other, truly looked at each other, for the first time, as sisters. That's why you were always so reserved, Isabella murmured, rocking Ethan. That's why you never allowed yourself to be fully part of the family. And that's why you were always so generous with me, Mary replied. Older sister instinct. Edward watched the interaction between the two, seeing how small gestures and expressions he had never noticed before now made sense. The way Isabella protected Mary during her confidence crises. The way Mary cared for Isabella during the difficult moments of adjusting to motherhood. There's one more thing, Isabella said, picking up one last document. The inheritance you received from your grandmother, part of it was mine too. What do you mean? Our dad was entitled to a portion of the inheritance when your grandmother died. He used that money to invest in Edward's company in the 1990s. Isabella showed the documents to Mary. So not only are you the heir to the family fortune, you have been my partner by right for decades. Mary stood still for a long time, processing the information. Do you know what this means? It means that Ethan not only has a mom who can nurse him properly, Edward said. He has an aunt who is genetically compatible with him. It means that when I took care of him, it wasn't just maternal instinct, Mary added. It was family instinct. Isabella moved closer to Mary, still holding Ethan. Mary, I don't know how I feel about our dad having maintained two families. I don't know if I can forgive him for that. But I know how I feel about having you as my sister. How? Grateful, immensely grateful. Isabella extended her free hand toward Mary. You saved my son. You saved my marriage. You taught me what it means to be a true family. Mary took Isabella's hand, and they stood there, holding hands with Ethan. Between them, two sisters who had found each other in the most unlikely way. Ethan will grow up knowing he has two mums who are sisters, Edward said, emotional. He will grow up in a family formed by love, not just by blood. And if we decide to have other children, Isabella looked at Edward, then at Mary, they will have the most qualified aunt in the world to take care of them. Mary smiled through her tears. So I really have a family now. You always have, Isabella replied. It just took us some time to find each other. Ethan drooled on Isabella's shirt and laughed, as if celebrating the fact that his family had finally fully recognized each other. Three adults who had started as strangers, who became employers and employee, who evolved into friends and partners, and who now discovered they were truly family, united not only by circumstances, but by DNA, by history, and most importantly, by love. The last revelation not only completed the puzzle of their lives, it revealed that sometimes destiny has more intricate and perfect plans than anyone could imagine. If you like this, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and if you watched until here, comment "I watched until here" and leave your opinion about this story. And don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the final screen because it's very emotional.